My idol might be an idol of success and everything that comes along with that. God, watch what I can do for you. And I can do all this without any help. That's the other thing. So it's an isolating idol too, very individualistic. And I notice that there's a spiritual pride lurking underneath all of this.
Welcome to the Being Formed podcast. I'm your host, Adam Ormord. The Being Formed podcast is a soul care ministry of LifePoint Resources. Our mission is to provide Christ-centered soul care to everyone in need so that each and every person can enjoy the fullness of life with God in the kingdom now and forever. This podcast supports LifePoint's mission simply through hosting conversations about life with God. What does it actually look like to live in such a way that our vision of flourishing, what we mean by the good life, is actually God-focused rather than self-focused, God-directed rather than culturally influenced, self-emptying rather than power-grabbing, floating rather than swimming or striving, resting and receiving rather than performing and earning. If you've been a listener of the Being Formed podcast, you'll quickly recognize that today's conversation is unique because instead of me asking the questions, the tables have been turned. This is actually a special release of an episode from a different podcast, the Signpost Inn podcast, hosted by our good friend, Brandon Booth. Brandon is a spiritual director. He's the co-founder of Signpost Inn, along with his wife, Liv. He's also a member of our soul care team here at LifePoint. And Brandon released this episode a few months ago on his podcast. I thought it'd be a good idea to give you a chance to listen to that conversation here and now. But before we get into it, a little behind the scenes might be helpful. Last summer, I was celebrating a dream come true. I was finally able to get my hands on a Ford Mustang convertible. As long as I can remember, I was drawn to these pony cars. Everything about them I just loved. But I figured I'd never be able to actually own one. I remember my friend Doug back in high school had a cherry red Mustang convertible, and we lived in Arizona, and he'd come and he'd pick me up with the top down, and we would drive to school or to Jack in the Box for tacos. If you know, you know. But fast forward a few decades, and I gotta tell you, living in Colorado during the summer is a pretty joyous experience, especially if you, like me, are drawn to nature as a way of communing with God. Well, as it turns out, driving through the mountains with the top down is even better. So Brandon and I shared the joy of my summer experience on his podcast. And it comes up in our conversation a few times. I thought you might like to have a little context for why we keep talking about convertibles. So finally, a bit of the timing on this re-release. You'll hear us talk about several topics, including my own battles with shame and my eventual realization that I wasn't going to be able to pull myself out of this cycle of shame without some help from others. So if you resonate with this, I encourage you to reach out. I know it's not easy to do, to admit that you can't do it on your own. But if you're willing to trust that God is ready and willing and able to help you, well, then LifePoint Resources is a ministry where you can receive the love and the support and the help that is waiting for you and being offered by God Himself. Speaking of shame, our next episode on the Being Formed podcast is a pretty important conversation with pastor and author Ken Shigematsu. Ken's latest book is entitled Now I Become Myself: How Deep Grace Heals Our Shame and Restores Our True Self. This is a powerful book, and our conversation captures that same power, so please make it a point to come back and listen. Today's conversation is an invitation to look to someone bigger than ourselves, bigger than even our best human vision of flourishing. It's an invitation to look to God, not to politicians or preachers or podcast hosts. Oh, how we need to look to God. And here's the deal. The more we look to God, the more we notice God. The more we notice God, the more we see the greatness of God's kingdom in this present moment, here and now, and yet not even fully revealed. It's a matter of attention and attentiveness. It's a matter of receiving and receptivity. It's a matter of fine-tuning and returning. So let's listen in as Brandon Booth interviews me here on the Being Formed podcast.
Listeners, if you don't know this, I was just recently on Adam's podcast, and we were talking about my book, my earlier book, Changing the Conversation, and listening, because he's been going through a series on active listening and listening skills and spiritual direction. Actually, some really cool interviews. I forget her name, but musicology, I think, if I'm saying that correctly.
We'll just call her Dr. Ann.
Yeah, fascinating interview. Adam and I have been just going back and forth. We've been having conversations behind the scenes and on air and all kinds of stuff, finding a lot of common ground, finding that we have a lot in common and a lot to talk about. If you know me at all, you know that I'm sort of on a permanent quest for friends. So if I smell that you might be a friend, and that's probably a terrible analogy, but if I see that you might be a friend, I tend to kind of hunt you down. So Adam, thank you for letting me kind of hunt you down and have conversations with you. It's been a lot of fun. Today, what we want to talk about is an article that you wrote, Adam, which titled "We All Look to You." And we're going to get into that in a minute. But listeners, the reason that I wanted to talk to Adam about this was because he quotes from that article a psalm that 104:27, and in the article, it's "These all look to you to give them their food in the due season." And the reason that leapt out at me, I think, Adam, I emailed you about this, is that it's in our Lutheran table prayer that comes from our catechism. And so my kids and I quote this almost every night. It's part of what we pray.
That's awesome.
Before we eat. So it really jumped out at me as being something that's central to sort of our family's spiritual practice, and something that kind of recurs in my own understanding of what's going on and what does it mean to attend to God. You begin talking about the me monster. If first of all, maybe tell us what that is a little bit and how this introduces the idea that you're getting at.
Well, basically, I think when I came across Psalm 104 around the time I wrote this, I was struck by the psalmist his attention was so turned to God that everything in there, all the ways that he was writing, it was the opposite of a me focus. All the pronouns and everything else were you and your. The whole thing, it just goes on and on and on. And I think maybe in the past, when I have come across this verse, it hasn't struck me because maybe I just thought, well, God's the creator. Okay, can we move on? Like, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I read books, novels and stuff, the over detailed details of like what is happening, like sometimes that can be really dry for me anyway. I want to get to the narrative. I want to get to some action or something like that. And that's maybe what this psalm has felt like in the past. But for some reason, as I was reading this, I was just so aware that there was space, that the psalmist, the writer, was making space and was in a place where they were not focused on themselves, which I think is what I was talking about, me monster. I've loved a comedian for many years now named Brian Regan. And he would probably be classified as a clean comedian, although, I wouldn't necessarily say that he's a Christ follower or anything like that. But he has just an incredibly hilarious bit on me monsters, like at a dinner table, where everyone's at a dinner table and everybody's talking and they're all talking about themselves. And the me monster's over there just, and he describes it as we talked about this in active listening too, by the way, in our podcast. The me monster is someone who listens, and what they're saying in their head is you, me, me. And so as soon as they can turn it back to themselves, right? And so he's just talking about like, he wishes he could be this guy at a dinner party who, like, everybody, all the me monsters are talking about all the things that they've done and how short the runways are in Aspen and all this stuff, right? And he says, I have this social dream that I was an astronaut and I actually walked on the moon. because no matter what anybody says, all these me monsters, right, just going at
Yeah.
it, I'm just sitting there quietly eating my food. And then eventually I just kind of speak up and say, I walked on the moon. So that's the joke, Brian Regan, me monster stuff. And I really just, I think that has helped me understand how to, bring this listening soul, this listening spirit, I think that I want to have and I'm trying to nurture into all of my relationships, whether that's with you or a directee or my wife, my children, but also with God,
Yeah.
especially with God, I would say.
Right. Bringing a listening soul into your relationship with God. Well, okay, so that's, the quote, here's what you say. So, essentially you point out that the psalmist is not a me monster.
Right.
And why is this significant? I'm just quoting you here. Because when we enter into sacred space with God, we tune our hearts to something bigger than ourselves. We come face to face with our loving Creator and Provider who knows our every need. In view of God's grace, our need for approval and affection fades into the background. We experience a bit of what it means to be in union with God. There's a lot there.
Mhm.
I love the phrase tune our hearts.
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of what you were talking about a little bit there about bringing that listening soul, if I'm understanding correctly. Can you maybe unpack that imagery a little bit? What does it mean to tune our hearts to something bigger than ourselves in this space?
Yeah. Well, I think to start with, my background in ministry and for most of my life is that I have been a musician and I was a worship pastor for a long, long time. I love choral conducting. I was a band director for a while. I grew up singing and playing instruments, being in choirs, directing choirs, conducting. I thought I was going to get my master's degree at one point in choral conducting. That was something I was very passionate about. And in any form of music where it's more than just you, there are two words we use a lot, and that's like blend and balance.
Hmm.
So when you're with an orchestra or band or choir, you are talking about, as you're singing in some kind of an ensemble, right? If you can't hear the people around you singing next to you on both sides of you, then you're too loud.
Mm.
You've got to back off and make sure that you can tune your ears and blend your voice and balance yourself in with the group, right? So that could be a duet, an ensemble, choir, whatever. So that's, first of all, I like the language of tune, my heart, because of that. Of course, it reminds me of one of my favorite hymns, Thou Fount of Every Blessing. And it says there, come, thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing your praise. So take and tune and readjust me, get me in balance, blend me in such a way that I can not just be focused on myself, but singing your praise. So that's probably where I resonate so much with tuning my heart. Is that, and there's a verse there, Brandon, that last verse, I think, of that hymn that nails, I think, what we're talking about. It says, let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Like, so let your goodness, like a chain, bind me to you, because the next part says, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it.
Yeah.
Prone to leave the God I love. So I'm constantly aware
Yeah.
that no matter how much I want to want you, like Tozer talks about, I have a proclivity to moving away from you naturally.
Yeah.
I need you, God, to tune me, to align me, to make me more attentive, right? To be receptive, to listen. The spirituality of receptivity is what we're talking about. So does that help?
Yeah. I'm going to immediately ask the how question in a second. Like, how does that
Mhm.
actually work? But I guess for me, it's striking the chord to keep with the imagery. If the heart is a string that can be plucked and needs to be tuned in order to resonate with the blend and the balance, where I'm at in my context, like in my life right now, a lot of the conversations I'm having, what I love about that imagery is it's so not information driven. It's so not instruct my head that I might think correctly. Not that that's bad. It's just the cry here is pluck the string of my heart, or tense it or untense it. I mean, tune it
Hmm.
so that
Yeah.
when it plucks, when you pluck it, it reverberates with love and praise.
Yeah.
Um,
I didn't even talk about the tune. I mean, when we think of tuning, it's like, is someone singing in or out of tune? Are all six strings in tune or out of tune? And we can hear the difference there. When you're talking about adjusting the tension on a string, for example, that's what you're doing. You tighten it and it raises the pitch just ever so slightly. If you loosen it and the vibrations get bigger, then the pitch is dropping slightly. You can tell when something is a little out of tune. I was a middle school, high school band director for a while,
yeah.
and I can tell when something is out of tune and it's too dissonant, and we need to get that. We need to get it back. So yeah, plucking the string of my heart, tuning has a lot of connotation for me, not just the blend and the balance, but also what needs to be adjusted
Yeah.
and how I'm
Yeah.
focusing in on you or not, just ever so slightly.
Yeah. Don't you want to be in tune with God though? Like, don't you know what I mean? I get it. You were
Yeah.
rightly saying we were moving us on. I'm just pausing for a moment in
Yeah.
my own feelings of like, man, I want that.
Hmm.
I want my heart to be there. I know it's not.
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
want
And
that.
how do you notice when it isn't? That's a good question, because
Mm.
talking about how do we get to where we want to be, but what do we notice the reality of our lives looks like so that it feels like we're not in tune?
Mm.
Maybe that's a question. And I don't know for you how you'd answer that, but
Well, that's why I think I'm stuck on the imagery,
mhm.
because I am not a musician. And my wife is going to listen to this podcast and laugh because she's the musician. She does choral music and everything else. And I can't hold a tune in a bucket. But I get the imagery. Adam, I can hear when the desires of my heart, when the reverberations that I'm attending to
Mhm.
are not in balance and blend, when they are out of tune with the deeper reality of God.
What do you hear? What do you
It
notice?
feels like dissonance in my heart. It feels
Mhm.
like dissonance in and I mean my chest.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, here's the thing I hope others can resonate with.
Mhm.
We're going to use all this language constantly now. But there's a certain level of being out of tune that you're so far out of tune you don't even notice it anymore. You're like so, and I'm talking about like one's life. You can be so distracted
Yeah.
by sin, by the worries, by the everyday issues.
Mhm.
Just don't even notice that the universe, that God is singing at a certain pitch. But I do think that once you put the top down on your Mustang and you drive in through the mountains
Oh, you're good, Brandon.
and you pick up on the fact that you haven't been looking, you've just been driving.
Yeah.
I think okay, just speaking for myself, that's when I
Mhm.
start to notice that I'm out of tune. That's a good
Mhm.
analogy.
Mhm.
Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, totally. Makes me think about some of the work that we do as spiritual directors. And man, I just had a session recently with someone who is walking through a hard time, and they know it. And they have actually been on a pretty cool journey where they've been attending to God more than probably they had in a long time. But now the season of their life that they're in and their work is very, very stressful. And I'm watching just like on a month by month basis what it looks like to just move ever so slightly away, but a little bit more at a time. And what I experienced most recently was a lot of compassion for my directee, because by this point now, the season has been going on for so long that there are now bags under the eyes and just kind of this. the emotions are right here right at the chest about, just so much. So, and so the language of the soul there is like, I have gone so far away. Now I feel it. Right. At first I thought I could manage it. At first I thought this wasn't going to be too much. But now how I feel is, wow, I, I'm further out of tune than I can stand. Right. So there's all the in-betweens. There's all the little things that slightly adjust the tuning.
Here's the thing that I want to turn on to, it is so easy for me, and I think I speak for listeners, to hear us talk about this, and it's like it's much easier to think behaviorally.
Mhm.
My behavior is out
Right.
of line
Totally.
than it is to hear what I feel like we're really trying to get at is it's the love, my love
Mhm.
expressed through my attention, and I want to deep dive into that a little bit in a minute. But that's how I would think of it right in this moment. I reserve the right to be stupid and wrong, but my love as seen through my attention or as expressed through what I'm attending to is out of line or out of it's not vibrating in the right wavelength.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And
And I think you're right. Like, I do think we do tend to think in terms of behavior only. Right?
yeah.
So we naturally are thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm still waking up and doing my quiet time the way I've always done it. Or I'm not, right? Or I've given that up. But we are prone to look toward the behavior, what can we do, or what have we stopped doing? And that leaves a gap, though, between what we're doing and what we're actually experiencing, the way you just described it so well.
Yeah. And it strikes me that the image that we get in this might go a short ways towards understanding the bizarre, the ones that were closest to the kingdom of God in Jesus's way of thinking were the down and outs, the ones that we would say their behavior is not very good.
Mm.
And the ones that were the farthest away were the pretty pious ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not casting shade on anybody today. I'm just, in my own life, I notice that what I think it means to be in tune with God is like, well, I'm pretty in control of my issues and I'm pretty good at my pious life. And I wonder if that sometimes is farther out of tune than I realize. Well, I know it is, to be honest. Like,
Yeah.
I know it is. Because really what I'm attending to is what you think of me, not what
Mhm.
God is doing.
Are you a fan of James K. A. Smith, his work?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
imagine you would be, because he talks a lot about liturgy, our
Yeah.
liturgy of our lives. One of the things he says in his book, You Are What You Love, it stuck with me, that our desires have been captivated by rival visions of flourishing. And like, that's what Jesus was maybe tending to, wanting us to notice, is like, hey, we all have visions of flourishing, of what the kingdom looks like, right? And then we have rival visions. We have those competing visions with that. So, if I think that a vision of flourishing is, I, will read my Bible and pray and tend to that time for a certain segment of the day, then I will go and chase after what I actually love. Which vision, what kingdom is it that we actually love? And I think that we're just caught in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
So I think, first of all, we have to notice, hey, this psalm is so God focused. Have I been God focused lately, or have I been me focused? Steve Macchia, I just did an interview with him. It's coming out in a couple of weeks, and he wrote a book called The Discerning Life. And in that book, he stresses a phrase called practicing a preference for God. And I asked him, like, if we're not preferring God, what are we preferring? And I kind of was wondering if he was going to explore, like, different idols, that we might chase after. He very basically just said, me. If I don't have a God, I either have a me preference or a God preference, period. So how do I practice a God preference?
I think the thing you go on to say in the article, like, that's the turn, right? Here's the how. To notice, you said. And maybe one way to do this right now is just to notice which direction our eyes are facing, our ears are turning.
Mm-hmm.
To whom do we look
Mhm.
to give us our food in the due season? In this sacred space, we tune our hearts to something bigger than ourselves. Well, what? We come face to face with our loving creator and provider who
Mhm.
knows our every need. You said a word that I think is captured here. You called it the spirituality of reception.
Mhm.
Or
Receptivity, right?
receptivity. Do you
Yeah.
mind expanding on that?
Okay. Well, I think you're the one who said this idea of receiving. And when I heard that receiving, I want you to know that's actually my word for the year.
Mm.
It's been something I've needed to rest in and really think about. And then I was part of a 9-month cohort thing recently here along the Front Range. And imagine that the very first cohort gathering we had was all about our capacity, our ability to receive, desire, our posture of receiving. And they kept saying, we're asking you, we're inviting you to trust God in this process and trust us and just be ready to receive. You don't have to work. You don't have to earn, prove, perform. You get to receive in this space. And so that word, I've just been trying to let that word have do some real deep work, I think, in me. So I'll just go on to say that that idea of receptivity, then tuning our ears or our hearts to hear God and to sing God's praise, right, is all part of this. And so for me, this word receive is an invitation to a posture of open-heartedness and open hands. It's an invitation for me to deal with the idols in my life, which of course is largely based around me, but this is how they look. My idol might be an idol of success.
Yeah.
And everything that comes along with that. And that's an idol because it's about what I can do for God. That's the root of it for me. God, watch what I can do for you. And I can do all this without any help. That's the other thing. So it's an isolating idol too, very individualistic. And I notice that there's a spiritual pride lurking underneath all of this. This notion that I can reach my goals, that I can somehow prove my worth, and I think I've been dealing with this most of my life, and I hope that's not what a convertible equals to me, right? But I've been battling this idea that whatever I can do, I will do in order to project an image or perform at a level that I can keep at bay and I can avoid my greatest fear, which is failure. And so that doesn't work. I know that. I've tried the life of trying to do it all by myself. It doesn't work. Kind of moved into counseling when I realized that the last thing I wanted was help. You want to hear an example of how that actually looked for me?
Yeah.
I've moved a few times in my life. And so every time I move, the people at the church or whatever will come and they'll help. But I feel shame every time somebody has to come help me move. But I can't do it by myself, right? Enough of these times that shame kind of builds up to a point where several years ago, I was moving from one house to another while still working at the same church. And the lead pastor of the church where I was at said to me on Sunday morning, like, hey, what time are you moving Saturday or whatever? And I got really I pulled back and I was trying to basically say, don't worry about it. Don't worry. I got it, whatever. And he looked at me and was like, why don't you want help?
Mm.
And I remember that hitting me really hard to the point where I had to actually hear myself say, not to him, but later on in my own with God, I need help. I finally had to say that I need help, which to me was pushing against that idol for me of like, do it, achieve, make it happen, prove your worth, right? Okay, so where am I going with all this? I think that shame that I noticed kind of left, and it was mostly unattended, it wasn't being dealt with, was making me, I couldn't receive anything. I couldn't receive help. I couldn't receive correction. I couldn't receive love.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't receive love. He was trying to love me well.
Yeah.
And I didn't want it. I was too filled with shame to receive it. And so I think this spiritual receptivity to me, this idea of like opening up and saying, I'm willing to let down whatever the guard is that I have and have an open-handed posture, open-hearted as well, is to be able to say, I can't do this on my own. I have to look to you. I have to look elsewhere for my needs to be met.
Which is why those kind of at the bottom, those at the end of their rope,
Mm-hmm.
those in the place of destitution are closest to the kingdom of God. Where else are we going to look, Lord?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You
Where
have
else
the
can we
words of
go?
eternal life.
Yeah.
You know, where else? It's the irony is it's not you finally admitting you needed help. It does not make you more holy. You're not a better person. You were just able to see the destitution that we all
Yeah.
have, that I have striven so hard to ignore.
Yeah, you're right. It's not the answer, but it does something. It opens me up.
Yeah.
Right. In the first posture, I'm completely shut off.
Yeah.
From the love that I so desperately want and need. That's what I actually want. And yet I'm shutting myself off from that very thing.
Yeah.
So you could say, hey, Adam, you are the beloved of God. I'd be like, no, I'm not.
Right.
Because I'm shut off from that. So I have to somehow turn, turn back, my eyes back to something other than myself, back to God, the creator who gives us all things in due season, and say, okay, here's a better posture, one of receiving, one of knowing you're the one, God, who gives us what we need.
These all look to you to give them their food in due season. I'm just quoting the article. Who or what are these?
Mm-hmm.
The writer lists the beasts of the field, wild donkeys, birds of the heaven, livestock, plants, humans, trees, wild goats, rock badgers, lions, sea creatures, even leviathan. All of these look to God who opens his hand and fills them with good things. The image I have of you, Adam, and myself even, of opening my hands and looking around and noticing I'm not alone. This is the way of all things, rock badgers and leviathans included. We all survive by opening our hands and letting the Lord provide. I feel the coming home into the rest of creation. My little brothers and sisters, the rock badgers. You know what I mean? They have something to teach me. Who are they looking to? And can I not join them? Am I not invited to be cared for, by the Lord who knows when even a sparrow falls? What an invitation to look to something bigger than me, to someone bigger than me, to notice that everybody else is invited to do the same.
I think that's why this passage struck me so much. 2 reasons, because obviously God is opening his hands up and pouring out all the time out of the goodness of God's heart. I mean, but also I had to imagine this psalmist actually writing this. Like, what kind of experience was he having with God when he wrote this? Like you said, this sense of oneness with God in everything he noticing.
I'm quite certain that he was in a convertible chariot through the mountains. So, because that's where you see these things.
Yeah, well, I said in the article, I picture maybe standing on a rock ledge looking out on a vista.
Yep. As you conclude the article, there's this wonderful ray of hope that I have experienced. You say the more one notices, the more one sees.
Mhm.
The soul takes it in, soaks it up, returning it all back to God as love. Awareness leads to love, and love increases awareness. And
Hmm.
what I love about that is the dance there, the
Mhm.
perpetual increase of love and awareness that can never end. So, as you've been describing this, I need help moment, but then turning to God moment, this noticing God's providence and care. It's such an interesting, let me ask it as a question.
Yeah.
I could imagine someone experiencing what you were talking about as being sort of more shame inducing. You need help and you've been denying it. Shame on you.
Mhm.
But the way I sense that you're experiencing it is it opened you up to notice God's love, which opened you up to notice more of God's love and so on.
Mhm.
Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of what, what the shift is. How does it happen? The hard thing for me is I don't know. And a lot of times with directees, they're asking essentially this question, like, there's a gap. I'm here. You're describing that I can experience this over here. Okay, so what do I do? And it's like I wish there was just a little switch you could flip,
Yeah.
and suddenly you'd have this awareness that leads to love, and love increasing awareness. But I guess answer, my short answer is it's a long obedience in the same direction. It's a long liturgy, thinking through the liturgy of our lives. It's a long reforming, reshaping, retelling, maybe a better story. And I think that's what happened for me. And I will add this caveat, not by myself. I didn't do it alone.
Mm-hmm.
I I'm so convinced of this. I think that if all it took was for us to have some kind of new way of seeing something, well, we'd all be there. We'd all have this new kind of, I don't know, new experiential relationship with God that we all long for. It was just suddenly like we'd open it up like a package from Amazon one day. But we need others, and that's how we're wired to love us into loving uh, beings to increase as love. So that for me was part of my journey. Some of my soul care journey was noticing who was with me on the journey, who was providing soul hospitality on the way, and not saying, "Do you see the destination? Let's hurry up and get there." But really just saying, "Can we be present in the moment to God's presence and just slowly begin to believe?" I think we even talked about this in our episode together earlier. Imagine, can you imagine? Would you be willing to imagine, right, that God's love is actually uh, greater
Better than
and
you've ever
bigger
thought
and
of. Yeah.
better, yeah, than what you can conceive of right now? So
It strikes.
again, it's time, and this has been a slow time for me.
There's a channel on YouTube that I can't remember the name of it now. He's a musician and he plays the guitar, but then he's gone on all these escapades to explore exotic and other instruments. And one of his episodes was on the largest organ in the world, the largest instrument in the world, and it's somebody who took a cave somewhere in the Midwest and turned I can never remember which one hangs from the ceiling,
Oh,
stalactites or stalagmites, but whichever one is hanging from the ceiling has turned those into uh, the instrument. There's little
hmm
solenoids that hits them. And this cave is huge. It's miles and miles and miles. And so it took them years. This was back in the 20s or 30s, but it was like about a decade of them exploring the cave and finding the stalactite that was close to the right pitch and then
yeah.
shaving it down to be what they wanted it to be.
That's
So
amazing.
this organ, there's an actual keyboard, like an
Uh-huh.
organ, sitting in one of the rooms, but then they have wires that stretch sometimes a mile or more away to a stalactite, and then they pipe it back in via speakers. But it's striking me that that's such a good imagery of God tuning the cave, my heart
Yeah.
over a long, long period of time,
Yeah.
finding the right place, shaving down that
Ooh,
stalactite until it
yeah.
gets to the right point.
Yeah.
And then, and I would be like, come on, man, just build an organ, get it over with.
Yeah.
And God's like, we're going to work with what we got. We're
Yeah.
going to take our time. This stalactite's not the right one right now. We're going to go over here. And it's not quite in tune yet. Let's
Mhm.
work on this for a while. Let's shave it
Yeah.
until it gets down to, you know what I mean? And I think that's, yeah.
That's the passion of God.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
The invitation, I think, if there is one here, at least listeners, the way I feel the invitation is first to some self-compassion that you may be out of tune.
Mm.
And that's okay. Join the club. Like, yeah. And what a great, beautiful gift if you've noticed it.
Mm-hmm.
What a gift if you have noticed your heart's out of tune and that there's an invitation to attend to the passion of God. And if that's where you are, I would also say, listen slowly.
Yeah.
What's the next thing God's asking?
Yeah. I use the language listen softer.
Oh,
Just-
yeah.
For the fun of it. But I think it's the idea of just without agenda, without trying so hard, without thinking that for example, I love how you said there could be a way that we notice, like in Psalm 104, that this psalmist is very God-focused and I am not, and now I feel shame, right? So my noticing is producing shame. Okay, so is there a way to listen softer?
To hear the love, to hear
Yeah.
where the passion for you is.
Yeah.
I will wrap it up this way. Listeners, if any of that has resonated with you, then I think there's an invitation to invite others into this space to help you listen softer. I definitely want to point you to lifepointresources.org, Adam's website. Again, Adam himself is a spiritual director, but he also has quite a few spiritual directors that are connected to his ministry kind of all over the country. So if you're interested in that, it'd be a great resource to find someone who can take the time to sit and tune with you, perhaps. I also highly recommend just head over to the website. There's a lot of resources. There's some really great stuff that Adam's been putting out. Adam, thank you. I've been benefiting from your materials, your podcast. The Being Formed podcast is Adam's podcast that I was on recently. Head over there, listeners, check that out. I know you do much more than spiritual direction and retreats and podcasts. You have a lot of things you offer, transfer coaching, things like that. Please, listeners, check it out.
Yeah.
Adam, where are you in this spot? Is there an invitation you have? Is there a leading you're sensing at the end here?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I just also want to echo what you just shared. I do feel like our ministries are cut from the same cloth, although I like the fact that your cloth has a liturgical, historical feeling to it that I'm learning a lot from as well. I just feel very confident that your spiritual direction and your retreat ministry that you offer is a wonderful ministry of hospitality to those who are in need. I'm excited about some of the retreats you have coming up, including the pastor's retreat in August. By the time this airs, that might have already happened.
It might be. I'm not
But
sure.
we're about a month and a half away from it now, and I'm just thinking about some pastors I know of who I think would really benefit from your ministry's hospitality. But yeah, for a way to kind of wrap this up, I actually was drawn to Tozer's prayer. It's kind of a very meaningful prayer for me from The Pursuit of God, but I'd love to just read it pray it.
Please.
Okay. O God, I have tasted your goodness, and it has both satisfied me and made me thirsty for more. I'm painfully conscious of my need of further grace. I'm ashamed of my lack of desire. O God, the triune God, I want to want you. I long to be filled with longing. I thirst to be made more thirsty still. Show me your glory, I pray, so I may know you indeed. Begin in mercy a new work of love within me. Give me grace to rise and follow you up from this misty lowland where I've wandered so long. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for listening to the Being Formed podcast. And thanks also to Brandon Booth and for his ministry at Signpost Inn. Check him out. His team puts together great resources, signpostinn.org. Thank you for being part of our community here at LifePoint. Together, we want to keep looking to God. So until next time, grace and peace.